Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Whether you're lying in bed scrolling endlessly, procrastinating on homework, or just letting your mind wander while you fold laundry, this is your space to slow down and think about something bigger. I'm here to tell you stories that textbooks skip, the kind that make you realize how strange and fragile our existence really is. If you're the type of person who enjoys deep dives into the forgotten corners of human history, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps this content reach other curious souls who might be searching for something more substantial than the usual 10-second attention span content. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you're doing while you listen. I love hearing from fellow night owls and deep thinkers. Now, tonight's story is about something most of us never really think about, but probably should. Why are we alone? Not alone as individuals, but alone as a species. Because here's something that might blow your mind. For most of human history, we weren't the only humans walking this planet. We shared the Earth with our cousins, other species that looked remarkably like us, thought like us, and lived lives just as complex as ours. But today, if you look around, there's only us, Homo sapiens, one human species scattered across every continent except Antarctica. And that's weird, really weird when you think about it. So what happened to everyone else? Where did they go? And why did we survive when they didn't? These aren't just academic questions. They're about understanding who we are, where we came from, and maybe most importantly, how incredibly unlikely it is that we're even here to ask these questions. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're walking through a forest 200,000 years ago. You hear footsteps behind you, and you turn around. Standing there is another person. They're upright, they're carrying tools, they have fire, but something's different. Their skull is slightly longer than yours, their brow ridge more pronounced, their build more robust. They're human, but not quite like you. This isn't science fiction. This was reality for tens of thousands of years. The world once hosted multiple human species simultaneously, each with their own territories, their own ways of life, their own solutions to the problem of staying alive in a harsh and unpredictable world. But before we dive into who these other humans were and what happened to them, we need to understand something fundamental about evolution. It's not a ladder. It's not a straight line from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex. Evolution is more like a tree with branches splitting and spreading in all directions. Some branches grow thick and strong, others remain small, and many simply break off and fall away. The human family tree was once incredibly bushy. We had cousins everywhere. Some were tall and lean, others short and stocky. Some lived in caves, others built shelters from mammoth bones. Some painted on walls, others carved intricate tools. Each had found their own way to be human. The story really begins around 2 million years ago in Africa, when our earliest ancestors first started walking upright and making stone tools. These weren't quite us yet, but they were definitely heading in our direction. As these early humans spread across Africa and eventually into other continents, they began to diverge. Separated by vast distances, different climates, and thousands of years of independent evolution, they slowly became distinct species. By about 500,000 years ago, there were multiple human species scattered across Africa, Europe, and Asia. In Europe, a group called Homo heidelbergensis was developing the traits that would eventually give rise to the Neanderthals. In Asia, populations that had descended from earlier migrants were evolving into what we now call Denisovans. And back in Africa, some groups were slowly becoming more and more like us, modern humans. This wasn't a competition. These weren't rival teams trying to eliminate each other. They were just different experiments in being human, each adapted to their particular corner of the world. The Neanderthals became incredibly well suited to the cold climates of Ice Age Europe. They were shorter and more muscular than us, with larger brains and faces perfectly designed to warm the frigid air they breathed. They lived in small groups, hunted massive animals, and survived through some of the harshest conditions Earth has ever seen. The Denisovans, meanwhile, adapted to the high altitudes and varied landscapes of Central and Eastern Asia. We don't know as much about what they looked like because we found very few of their bones, but we know they were there, and we know they were successful because their DNA lives on in some modern human populations today. And then there were the island humans, the most mysterious of all. On isolated islands in Southeast Asia, human populations evolved in complete isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. Cut off from the mainland, they became smaller, developing unique adaptations to their island environments. On Flores, a species called Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbits, stood barely 3 feet tall but still made sophisticated tools and hunted pygmy elephants. On Luzon, another species called Homo luzonensis developed their own distinct characteristics, perfectly adapted to island life. These weren't primitive humans waiting to evolve into something better. They were fully realized species, each as valid and complex as we are today. They had their own cultures, their own ways of solving problems, their own relationships with their environments. In many cases, they had been around much longer than we had. So what makes this story so haunting is that none of them are here anymore. Somewhere between 100,000 and 30,000 years ago, they all began to disappear. Not all at once, not in some dramatic extinction event, but gradually, quietly, leaving behind only bones, tools, and in some cases, traces of their DNA that still flow through our veins. The Neanderthals, who had survived multiple ice ages and lived successfully in Europe for over 300,000 years, began to fade around 40,000 years ago. The last known populations held on in places like Gibraltar and southern Spain, but by 28,000 years ago, they were gone. The Denisovans vanished even more mysteriously, leaving behind so few physical remains that we only discovered they existed in 2010, when scientists extracted DNA from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave. The island humans lasted longer in some places, but they too eventually disappeared. Homo floresiensis may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago, and there are even local legends in Indonesia about small human-like creatures that some researchers think might be cultural memories of these vanished cousins. And then there were the ghost populations, groups we know existed not because we found their bones, but because we found their genes. Hidden in the DNA of modern humans are traces of at least 3 or 4 different archaic human species that we've never even discovered. They lived, they bred with our ancestors, and then they vanished, leaving behind only molecular fingerprints in our genetic code. So what happened? How did a world that was once home to multiple human species end up with just us? The answer isn't simple, and it probably isn't what you'd expect. This wasn't a story of war or conquest, at least not primarily. It wasn't that we were smarter or stronger or better adapted. In many cases, the other human species were actually better suited to their environments than we were. Instead, it seems to have been a combination of factors, each contributing to a slow, inexorable process that played out over tens of thousands of years. Climate change played a role, as the Earth went through dramatic shifts that altered entire ecosystems. Disease may have been a factor, as different human populations came into contact and shared pathogens to which they had no immunity. Population dynamics mattered too. Small isolated groups are inherently vulnerable to extinction, whether from natural disasters, inbreeding, or simple bad luck. And then there was interbreeding. Rather than completely replacing other human species, we may have absorbed them, breeding with them until their distinct lineages disappeared into our expanding population. But perhaps most importantly, there was something about our particular branch of humanity that allowed us to survive when others didn't. Not necessarily superior intelligence, but maybe superior flexibility. Our ability to adapt quickly to new environments, to innovate when faced with challenges, to form large cooperative groups, and to pass knowledge from one generation to the next through increasingly sophisticated forms of communication. We became the generalists in a world where being a specialist could be a death sentence. When climates shifted, we moved. When resources became scarce, we found crucially, we did all of this as new ones. When our old tools didn't work, we invented new ones. And groups, sharing information and innovations across vast networks of related populations. But here's what makes this story truly profound. We almost didn't make it either. There were moments in our own history when we came incredibly close to extinction. Genetic studies suggest that, at one point, maybe 70,000 years ago, the entire human population may have dwindled to just a few thousand individuals. We were hanging by a thread, just like our cousins who didn't make it through. The difference is that we got lucky. We had just enough genetic diversity, just enough population size, just enough adaptability to squeeze through the bottlenecks that killed everyone else. We survived not because we were destined to, but because we happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right combination of traits. And that brings us to perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. We are alone by accident. There's nothing inevitable about our survival, nothing that guaranteed we would be the last humans standing. We're here not because we won some grand competition, but because we were the ones who happened to keep going when everyone else stopped. This loneliness, this uniqueness among human species is actually quite rare in the animal kingdom. Most successful animal groups diversify into multiple species that coexist for millions of years. Look at birds or insects, or even other primates, but somehow the human story became a story of consolidation, of many becoming one, and that raises profound questions about who we are and what our future holds. If multiple human species could coexist for hundreds of thousands of years, what does it mean that we're now alone? Have we lost something important by becoming the only humans left? And given how precarious our own survival has been, how confident can we be that our story will continue? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. Understanding how and why we became the last humans has real implications for how we think about our place in the world, our responsibilities to other species, and our own future survival. Because if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that nothing is permanent, nothing is guaranteed, and even the most successful species can vanish if circumstances turn against them. The more we dig into this mystery, the more we realize just how strange our situation really is. Because when you look at the fossil record, what you find isn't a neat progression from primitive to modern. What you find is chaos, beautiful, complex chaos. Picture this. Around 300,000 years ago, if you could take a helicopter ride across Africa, Europe, and Asia, you'd see human campfires flickering in caves from Spain to Siberia to South Africa. But the people tending those fires wouldn't all look the same. Some would have the heavy brows and robust frames that we now associate with Neanderthals. Others would have the broader faces and massive teeth of Denisovans. Still others would look almost exactly like us, but with subtle differences in skull shape or limb proportions that would mark them as something distinct. This wasn't a world of primitive cave dwellers waiting for evolution to perfect them. These were sophisticated people with their own technologies, their own art, their own ways of understanding the world. The Neanderthals weren't shambling brutes. They were master toolmakers who could craft spears so perfectly balanced that modern replicas barely match their quality. They cared for their disabled, buried their dead with flowers, and may have been the first humans to create symbolic art in caves. The Denisovans, despite leaving us almost no physical remains, clearly had an incredibly sophisticated understanding of their environment. We know this because their genetic legacy includes adaptations that allowed humans to thrive at extreme altitudes. Innovations that are still helping Tibetan populations survive in the thin air of the Himalayas today. And those island humans, they weren't evolutionary dead ends. They were master survivors who had figured out how to live sustainably on isolated landmasses for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo floresiensis, those 3-foot-tall hobbits, weren't just smaller versions of us. They had their own unique anatomy, their own tool traditions, their own ways of hunting the pygmy elephants and giant rats that shared their island home. What's truly mind-bending is that all of these different human species were living at the same time, sometimes in remarkably close proximity. There's evidence that Neanderthals and early modern humans were living in the same regions of the Middle East, possibly even using the same caves at different times. In some cases, they may have encountered each other directly. Can you imagine what those meetings might have been like? Two groups of humans, clearly related but distinctly different, encountering each other around a water source or at the entrance to a cave. Did they fight? Did they trade? Did they simply stare at each other in mutual incomprehension before going their separate ways? We know that at least sometimes they did more than just stare, because hidden in our DNA today are the traces of these ancient encounters. Modern humans who aren't of recent African ancestry carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. People from Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia carry even more Denisovan DNA, sometimes as much as 6%. This means that, at some point, our ancestors didn't just meet these other humans, they formed relationships with them. They had children together, and those hybrid children survived and had children of their own, passing down a genetic legacy that we still carry today. But here's where the story gets complicated, because even though we carry their DNA, even though we know they successfully interbred with our ancestors, these other human species still disappeared. So the question becomes, did we absorb them, or did we replace them? The answer seems to be both, and neither, depending on where and when you're talking about. In some places, there's evidence of gradual mixing and absorption. In others, it looks more like replacement, with modern human populations moving into areas previously occupied by other species. And in still others, the archaeological record just goes quiet, with no clear indication of what happened to the previous inhabitants. Take the Neanderthals, for example. For a long time, scientists thought they went extinct around 40,000 years ago, completely replaced by incoming modern humans. But newer research is painting a much more complex picture. Some Neanderthal populations may have survived much longer than we thought, possibly as late as 28,000 years ago in isolated refuges like Gibraltar. And the DNA evidence suggests that interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans happened multiple times over tens of thousands of years. This paints a picture not of sudden replacement, but of a long, slow process of contact, mixing, and gradual absorption. Some Neanderthal groups may have been directly incorporated into expanding modern human populations. Others may have maintained their distinct identity for thousands of years before finally disappearing due to climate change, disease, or simple demographic bad luck. The Denisovans are even more mysterious. We have so few physical remains from them that we're still not sure exactly what they looked like or where they lived. But their genetic legacy is scattered across a huge geographic area, from Siberia to Southeast Asia to the Pacific Islands. This suggests they weren't a single, isolated population, but a diverse group of related populations spread across much of Asia. Some Denisovan groups clearly interbred with the ancestors of modern Asians and Pacific Islanders, contributing genes that are still helping people survive in challenging environments today. But other Denisovan populations seem to have disappeared without leaving any genetic trace, vanishing so completely that we only know they existed because of a few teeth and bone fragments found in Siberian caves. And then there are the ghost populations, the human groups we know existed not because we found their bones, but because we found their genes. Advanced DNA analysis has revealed that modern African populations carry genetic signatures from at least 2 or 3 different archaic human species that we've never identified in the fossil record. These mysterious ancestors contributed genes and then vanished, leaving behind only molecular echoes in our genomes. This genetic archaeology is revealing just how complex and interconnected the human story really is. Rather than a simple family tree with clear branches, human evolution looks more like a braided river with multiple streams flowing together, separating and rejoining over hundreds of thousands of years. But this still doesn't answer the central question. Why us? Why did we become the only human species to survive into the present day? What made us different from all our cousins who didn't make it? One possibility is that we got lucky with our geography. Modern humans evolved in Africa, which has the most stable and diverse ecosystems on the planet. While our cousins were adapting to the specific challenges of Ice Age Europe or isolated Asian highlands, we were developing in an environment that rewarded flexibility and adaptability rather than specialization. When climate change or other challenges arose, we were already practiced at adapting to new environments. We could move, innovate, and survive in ways that more specialized populations couldn't match. Our generalist approach to survival may have given us an edge when the world started changing rapidly. Another possibility is that we developed something unique in our social organization or communication abilities. There's growing evidence that modern humans were creating increasingly sophisticated networks of trade, information exchange, and cultural transmission. We weren't just surviving as isolated bands, we were connecting across vast distances, sharing innovations, and maintaining genetic diversity through long-distance mate exchange. This networking ability may have been crucial during times of crisis. When local populations faced extinction-level challenges, they could draw on resources, knowledge, and even genetic diversity from allied groups hundreds or thousands of miles away. Our cousins living in smaller, more isolated populations didn't have these safety nets, but perhaps most importantly, we may have developed a unique relationship with change itself. While other human species became highly adapted to specific environments and ways of life, we seem to specialize in not specializing. We became the masters of adaptation, capable of rapidly developing new technologies, new social structures, and new survival strategies in response to changing conditions. This flexibility came at a cost. We never achieved the perfect adaptation to cold climates that the Neanderthals did, or the high-altitude specialization of some Denisovan populations. But what we lost in specialized efficiency, we gained in general resilience. And in a world of constant change, resilience turned out to matter more than perfection. Of course, there's also the uncomfortable possibility that our success came partly at the expense of our cousins. Not necessarily through direct violence, though that may have occurred, but through more subtle forms of competition. We may have been better at exploiting resources, more effective at forming large cooperative groups, or simply more successful at reproducing in challenging environments. If we were even slightly more successful than our cousins at surviving and reproducing, that small advantage would compound over thousands of generations. Eventually, we would come to dominate the environments we shared, not through conquest, but through simple demographic mathematics. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. We almost didn't make it either. The same forces that drove our cousins to extinction nearly got us too. There's genetic evidence that the entire human population went through at least one severe bottleneck, possibly as recently as 70,000 years ago, when we may have numbered only a few thousand individuals worldwide. We survived that bottleneck, but just barely, and the fact that we're here today doesn't mean we were destined to survive. It just means we were the ones who happened to make it through. In another timeline, with slightly different circumstances, we might be the extinct cousins that some other human species is studying today. This realization should be deeply humbling. We're not the pinnacle of evolution or the inevitable result of some grand plan. We're the lucky survivors of a process that killed everyone else who was like us. And that makes our current dominance of the planet both precious and precarious. Because if there's one thing the extinction of our cousins teaches us, it's that nothing lasts forever. Species that survive for hundreds of thousands of years can still disappear. Populations that seem perfectly adapted to their environments can still be wiped out by changes they never saw coming. Even intelligence, culture, and technology offer no guarantee against extinction. We are living in the aftermath of what might be the greatest extinction event in human history. And the strangest part, we caused it just by existing. Think about it this way. Every time you look in the mirror, you're looking at the face of a survivor. Not just of wars or famines or natural disasters, but of something much more profound. You're looking at the last representative of a story that once had many more characters. The extinction of our human cousins wasn't like the extinction of the dinosaurs. There was no asteroid, no dramatic volcanic eruption that wiped everyone out in a geological instant. Instead, it was a slow fade, played out over tens of thousands of years, so gradual that no one alive at the time would have noticed it happening. But here's where the story gets really unsettling. We might have been the cause, not through some deliberate campaign of extermination, but through something much more subtle and perhaps more troubling. We may have been what biologists call an invasive species, not invading from another planet, but invading from our own evolutionary homeland in Africa, spreading across the world and inadvertently disrupting ecosystems that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. When modern humans first left Africa, around 70,000 years ago, we weren't necessarily more advanced than the human species we encountered. The Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. They were stronger, better adapted to cold climates, and had sophisticated technologies that in some ways surpassed our own. The Denisovans had survived in challenging high-altitude environments that we could barely tolerate. But we had something different. We had what evolutionary biologists call behavioral modernity. Not necessarily superior intelligence, but a particular kind of cognitive flexibility that allowed us to adapt rapidly to new situations, to innovate on the fly, and most importantly, to cooperate in increasingly large and complex social networks. This flexibility came with a dark side. We weren't just adapting to new environments, we were changing them. Everywhere modern humans went, we left a trail of ecological disruption. Large mammals went extinct. Landscapes were altered by our use of fire. Local ecosystems that had been stable for millennia suddenly faced pressures they had never encountered before. Our human cousins, who had evolved alongside these ecosystems over hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly found themselves competing not just with a new human species, but with a new kind of human behavior. We weren't just another predator or another competitor for resources. We were something unprecedented, a species that could rapidly alter its own behavior, and in doing so, alter entire environments. Take what happened in Australia. When modern humans first arrived there around 50,000 years ago, they encountered a continent full of giant animals that had never seen humans before. Within a few thousand years, most of these megafauna were extinct. We didn't hunt them all to death directly. Instead, our presence, our use of fire, our hunting pressure, and our general disruption of established ecosystems created a cascade of changes that these animals couldn't adapt to quickly enough. Something similar may have happened to our human cousins, but in slow motion, over much longer timescales. The Neanderthals weren't driven to extinction by human armies. They were gradually squeezed out by human behaviors that slowly made their traditional ways of life unsustainable. We were more mobile than they were, more willing to move into new territories when resources became scarce. We formed larger social networks that could share information and resources across vast distances. We developed more flexible tool technologies that could be adapted to different environments. And perhaps most importantly, we were more willing to exploit marginal habitats that other human species avoided. This meant that when climate change or other environmental pressures arose, we had options that our cousins didn't. We could move, adapt, innovate, or call on distant allies for help. They were often stuck with their traditional territories and traditional ways of life, even when those were no longer sufficient for survival. But here's what makes this story even more complex. We didn't just outcompete our cousins, we absorbed them. The genetic evidence is clear that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and probably several other archaic human species that we haven't even discovered yet. This interbreeding wasn't necessarily friendly or consensual. When one population is expanding and another is contracting, the genetic exchange often reflects the power dynamics of that relationship. The fact that we carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA doesn't mean we lived in harmony with them. It might mean exactly the opposite. Population genetics tells us that the interbreeding was often asymmetrical. Modern human women had children with Neanderthal and Denisovan men, but the reverse seems to have been less common. This pattern is consistent with what anthropologists call demographic absorption, the gradual incorporation of a declining population into an expanding one. Over many generations, the distinct genetic and cultural identity of the smaller population gets diluted and eventually disappears, even though individual genes may survive in the expanding population. It's not genocide in the violent sense, but it's still the elimination of a unique form of humanity, and this process may still be happening today. Indigenous populations around the world are facing similar pressures from expanding global cultures. Their distinct languages, traditions, and ways of life are disappearing not through direct persecution, but through the same gradual process of demographic and cultural absorption that may have eliminated our ancient cousins. But let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because there's something even more disturbing about our uniqueness as the last human species. We're not just alone among humans, we're alone in a way that's almost unprecedented in the natural world. Most successful animal lineages diversify over time. They split into multiple species that occupy different ecological niches, often coexisting for millions of years. Look at cats. There are dozens of different cat species, from house cats to tigers to lynx, each adapted to different environments and ways of life. The same is true for dogs, bears, primates, and most other mammalian groups. But humans took the opposite path. We started with diversity and ended with unity. We went from many species to one, from a rich tapestry of different ways of being human to a single surviving lineage. And that raises a profound question. What did we lose in that process? Each extinct human species represented a unique solution to the problem of being human. The Neanderthals had found a way to thrive in Ice Age Europe that was completely different from our approach. The Denisovans had adapted to high-altitude environments in ways that we're still trying to understand. The island humans had developed sustainable ways of life on isolated land masses that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. When these species went extinct, we didn't just lose their genes, we lost their knowledge, their cultures, their unique perspectives on what it means to be human. We lost alternative ways of organizing society, alternative relationships with the natural world, alternative solutions to the fundamental challenges of survival and meaning. In some sense, we're living in an impoverished world, not materially impoverished. Obviously, we've been incredibly successful at exploiting Earth's resources, but culturally and intellectually impoverished. We're trying to solve all of humanity's problems with a single approach, a single way of thinking, a single set of assumptions about how humans should live. What if the Neanderthals had survived? What if we could compare our technological, growth-oriented approach to their more sustainable small group lifestyle? What if the island humans were still around to show us how to live within ecological limits? What if the Denisovans could teach us about high-altitude adaptation, or the ghost populations could offer us insights into different ways of organizing human societies? We'll never know, because we eliminated those alternatives before we even knew they existed. And in doing so, we may have eliminated options that we desperately need as we face the challenges of the 21st century and beyond. Climate change, resource depletion, overpopulation, social inequality, these are all problems that our particular way of being human has created or exacerbated. But they might not be unsolvable problems if we had access to the full range of human wisdom and experience. Unfortunately, we eliminated most of that wisdom before we realized we might need it. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. Are we still doing it? Are we still in the process of eliminating human diversity, just more subtly than our ancestors did? Today, there's only one human species, but there are still thousands of different human cultures, each with their own languages, traditions, and ways of understanding the world. But these cultures are disappearing at an alarming rate. Languages die out every few weeks. Traditional ways of life are abandoned as people move to cities and adopt globalized lifestyles. Indigenous knowledge about sustainable living, medicinal plants, and alternative social organizations is being lost faster than we can document it. In some sense, we're still in the process of becoming the only humans left. Not biologically this time, but culturally. We're moving toward a world where everyone speaks the same languages, watches the same movies, eats the same foods, and thinks about the world in the same ways. And just like the biological extinction of our human cousins, this cultural extinction is happening not through deliberate policy, but through the same inexorable processes of demographic expansion, economic competition, and technological change that drove our ancestors to replace their human cousins. The question is, do we want to complete this process? Do we want to live in a world where there's not just one human species, but effectively one human culture? Or can we learn from the extinction of our biological cousins and find ways to preserve the diversity that remains? Because here's the thing about extinction. Once it's complete, it's irreversible. We can sequence Neanderthal DNA and try to understand their culture through their tools and art, but we can never bring them back. We can never ask them what they thought about the world, or learn from their different ways of solving human problems. The same will be true for the human cultures that are disappearing today. Once they're gone forever, and with them go unique ways of being human that took thousands of years to develop and can never be recovered. So maybe the real lesson of the extinction of our human cousins isn't just about the past, maybe it's a warning about the future. We survived when our cousins didn't, but we're still facing the same fundamental challenges they faced. How to live sustainably, how to maintain diversity in the face of expansion, how to adapt to changing conditions without losing what makes us human. The difference is that this time, we know what extinction looks like. We've seen what happens when human diversity disappears, and we have a choice about whether to let it continue or to find new ways of being human that preserve the alternatives we have left. The extinction of our human cousins wasn't a single event. It was a slow fade that played out across tens of thousands of years, and the more we study it, the more we realize just how close we came to joining them in oblivion. Let's talk about numbers for a moment, because numbers tell a story that bones can't. When we look at the genetic evidence from modern humans, we can trace our entire non-African ancestry back to a single migration event around 70,000 years ago. That's remarkable enough on its own, but here's what's truly staggering. That migration may have involved as few as 1,000 to 10,000 individuals. Think about that. Everyone living outside of Africa today, all billions of us, descended from a group smaller than a typical high school. That's not the sign of a dominant species conquering the world. That's the sign of a species barely hanging on, squeezing through a demographic bottleneck so narrow that it's almost miraculous we survived at all, and we weren't the only ones facing these challenges. Population genetic studies of Neanderthal remains reveal something deeply troubling. Their effective population size may never have exceeded 10,000 individuals across their entire range. For a species that occupied territory from Spain to Siberia, that's incredibly small. To put it in perspective, there are more people living in a single city block in Manhattan than there were Neanderthals in the entire world at any given time. Small populations are inherently unstable. They're vulnerable to what scientists call stochastic events, random catastrophes that can wipe out entire lineages. A volcanic eruption, a particularly harsh winter, a disease outbreak, or even just a run of bad luck with births and deaths can push a small population past the point of no return. The Neanderthals seem to have been living on this knife's edge for their entire existence. Genetic analysis shows signs of repeated bottlenecks, periods where their population crashed to just a few hundred individuals before slowly recovering. Each bottleneck made them more inbred, less genetically diverse, and more vulnerable to the next crisis. But here's where the story gets really interesting. We have evidence that some of these bottlenecks may have been caused by contact with us. When modern humans first expanded out of Africa, we didn't just bring our tools and our culture. We brought our diseases, pathogens that had evolved alongside African populations for hundreds of thousands of years. Diseases that we had developed immunity to through generations of exposure. But our human cousins had never encountered these microbes before. We see this pattern throughout history. When European diseases reached the Americas, they devastated Native American populations who had no natural immunity. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population. Even today, isolated populations can be wiped out by diseases that cause nothing more than a mild cold in people who grew up with them. Now imagine this happening in slow motion over thousands of years between different human species. Every time modern humans moved into a new territory, every time we came into contact with our cousins, we may have been carrying invisible biological weapons that we didn't even know we possessed. The genetic evidence supports this grim possibility. Modern humans today carry immune system genes that we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans. These genes help us fight off diseases that are common in Europe and Asia. But why would we have inherited these genes if our cousins were already extinct when we arrived? The most logical explanation is that we encountered them while they were still alive, interbred with them, and inherited their immunities because we needed them to survive the diseases they carried. But here's the crucial asymmetry. We inherited their immunities, but they may not have inherited ours. If African diseases were more virulent or more numerous than European or Asian ones, then contact with us could have been devastating for our cousins, while contact with them was merely challenging for us. This isn't speculation. We can see it happening in the archaeological record. In Europe, there's a clear pattern. Neanderthal sites become less common after modern humans arrive in the area. It's not immediate replacement, it's gradual decline. Populations that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly start shrinking, fragmenting, disappearing. The same pattern shows up in climate data. Around 40,000 years ago, Europe was hit by one of the harshest cold periods of the entire Ice Age. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption in Italy covered much of Europe in volcanic ash, creating a nuclear winter effect that lasted for years. Temperatures plummeted, vegetation died, and animal populations crashed. For the Neanderthals, who were already living in small scattered populations, this may have been the final blow. They were perfectly adapted to cold climates, but they weren't adapted to catastrophic environmental collapse, combined with competition from a new species and exposure to new diseases. Modern humans, with our larger population sizes, our more flexible social networks, and our ability to rapidly adapt our behaviour to changing conditions, were better positioned to survive this crisis. We could move when the Neanderthals couldn't. We could innovate when they were constrained by tradition. We could call on distant allies when they had no one to turn to. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even really a fight at all. It was a collision between different evolutionary strategies, and the strategy that emphasized flexibility and rapid adaptation happened to be better suited to a period of rapid environmental change. In a stable world, the Neanderthal strategy might have been superior. Their deep knowledge of local environments, their specialized tools, their tight-knit social groups, these might have been advantages in a predictable world. But the world they lived in wasn't predictable. It was chaotic, unstable, full of surprises that their evolutionary strategy hadn't prepared them for. And the sad irony is that they almost certainly didn't know what was happening to them. Extinction, when it happens gradually, is invisible to the people experiencing it. Each generation might notice that there are fewer children than there used to be, that some of the old camping sites aren't being used anymore, that it's getting harder to find marriage partners, but they wouldn't have understood that they were witnessing the end of their entire lineage. There may have been a day when the last Neanderthal died, alone in a cave in Gibraltar or southern Spain, with no idea that they were the final representative of a species that had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and countless other challenges over the course of 400,000 years. They probably died thinking they were just another person having a bad day, not knowing they were the end of a chapter in human history that would never be written again. The Denisovans faced similar challenges, but their story is even more mysterious because we know so little about them. We've found traces of their DNA scattered across Asia, from Siberia to New Guinea, suggesting they were once widespread and successful. But their physical remains are so scarce that we're still not sure what they looked like or how they lived. What we do know is that they survived in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The high-altitude adaptations that modern Tibetans inherited from Denisovans allow people to live at elevations where most humans would suffer from chronic altitude sickness. These weren't primitive people struggling to survive. They were specialists who had mastered one of the most demanding environments on the planet. But specialization, as the Neanderthals learned, can be a double-edged sword. When your entire survival strategy is built around a specific environment or way of life, you become vulnerable to changes that more generalist species can adapt to. Climate change, competition from modern humans, or even just random demographic fluctuations could have been enough to push specialized populations over the edge. The island humans faced a different set of challenges. Isolated on land masses surrounded by ocean, they were protected from many of the pressures that affected mainland populations. They didn't have to compete with modern humans or deal with the diseases we carried. They didn't face the same climate pressures or volcanic catastrophes. Instead, they faced the unique challenges of island life: limited resources, small population sizes, and isolation from the genetic diversity that mainland populations could draw on. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they adapted to these constraints, becoming smaller, more efficient, perfectly suited to their island environments. But island adaptations come with their own vulnerabilities. Small populations are inherently unstable, vulnerable to natural disasters, disease outbreaks, or even just random demographic fluctuations. And islands, no matter how isolated, aren't completely cut off from the outside world. When sea levels dropped during ice ages, islands that had been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly became accessible to mainland populations. Modern humans, with our boats and our willingness to explore new territories, eventually reached even the most remote islands. And when we did, we brought with us all the same pressures that had driven our cousins to extinction on the mainland. The arrival of modern humans on these islands wasn't necessarily violent or dramatic. We may have simply been better at exploiting the available resources, more successful at reproducing, more adaptable to environmental changes. Over time, through simple demographic mathematics, we may have gradually replaced the island populations that had called these places home for hundreds of millennia. Homo floresiensis, those 3-foot-tall hobbits of Indonesia, may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. That means they were still alive when modern humans were already creating sophisticated art in Europe and Australia. They weren't evolutionary relics waiting to be replaced by something better. They were contemporary humans with their own cultures, their own technologies, their own ways of understanding the world. But they were also living on borrowed time. Once modern humans developed the maritime technology to reach their islands, their isolation was broken. And once their isolation was broken, The same forces that had eliminated our cousins everywhere else began to operate on their small populations. What's particularly tragic about the extinction of our human cousins is how recent some of it was. We're not talking about deep prehistoric events that happened so long ago, they feel mythical. Some of these extinctions happened well within the time frame of human memory and oral tradition. There are legends among Indonesian populations about small human-like creatures living in the forests. Aboriginal Australian stories describe encounters with different types of people who looked and behaved differently from themselves. Some researchers think these might be cultural memories of actual encounters with other human species. If that's true, then the extinction of our cousins wasn't just a prehistoric event that we can only study through fossils and DNA. It was something that our own ancestors witnessed, remembered, and passed down through stories. We may actually have cultural memories of the time when we weren't alone. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. We might not be done yet. Because while we're the only human species left, we're not necessarily safe from the same forces that eliminated everyone else. Our current global population of nearly 8 billion people makes us seem incredibly successful. But that success is built on foundations that might be more fragile than we realize. We depend on global supply chains, fossil fuels, stable climates, and complex social institutions that could all be disrupted by the same kinds of catastrophic events that drove our cousins to extinction. Climate change, nuclear war, pandemic disease, ecological collapse. These are all modern versions of the same challenges that eliminated the Neanderthals, Denisovans, and island humans. And our response to these challenges will determine whether we join our cousins in extinction or find new ways to adapt and survive. The difference is that this time, we know what extinction looks like. We've studied it, mapped it, traced its genetic signatures through our own genomes. We know that intelligence, culture, and technology offer no guarantee against extinction. We know that species that survive for hundreds of thousands of years can still disappear when conditions turn against them. But we also know something our cousins didn't. We know we're alone. We know we're the last representatives of a story that once had many more characters. And that knowledge comes with a responsibility that no species has ever had before. We're not just responsible for our own survival anymore. We're responsible for preserving the memory of everyone who came before us, for learning from their extinctions, and for making sure that the story of humanity doesn't end with us. Because if there's one thing the extinction of our human cousins teaches us, it's that nothing is permanent, nothing is guaranteed, and even the most successful species can vanish if they stop adapting to a changing world. We survived this long, not because we were destined to, but because we were lucky enough and flexible enough to keep going when everyone else stopped. The question now is whether we can keep that flexibility, that adaptability, that willingness to change when the world changes around us, because the alternative isn't just our own extinction, it's the end of the only lineage left that remembers what it was like when humans came in many forms, when the world was full of different ways of being human, when we weren't alone. And maybe, if we're very careful and very wise, we can make sure we never are alone again. Not by bringing back our extinct cousins, because that's impossible, but by preserving the diversity that remains, by protecting the different ways of being human that still exist, and by making sure that the future of our species is as rich and varied as our past once was. Because we are the children of survivors, the descendants of the lucky ones. And the greatest way we can honour our extinct cousins is by making sure their story, and ours, continues. But there's something we haven't talked about yet, something that makes our survival even more remarkable and more fragile than we've realised. Because the story of human extinction isn't just about our ancient cousins disappearing tens of thousands of years ago, it's about patterns that are still playing out today in ways that should terrify us. Let me tell you about the most disturbing discovery in modern genetics. When scientists started mapping human DNA from populations around the world, They expected to find the usual pattern you see in other species. Lots of genetic diversity spread across different regions, with each population adapted to its local environment. Instead, they found something unprecedented in the natural world. All of humanity, every single person alive today, shows less genetic diversity than a single troop of chimpanzees in one forest in Africa. Think about that. There are individual chimp communities with more genetic variation than the entire human species, spread across 7 continents. This isn't normal. It's a massive red flag that tells us something catastrophic happened to our species, something that reduced us to such a small population that we barely survived at all. And it happened recently, in evolutionary terms. So recently that we haven't had time to diversify again. The technical term for this is a population bottleneck, and the evidence suggests we went through at least one severe bottleneck around 70,000 years ago. Some estimates put our entire global population at fewer than 10,000 individuals. Others suggest it might have been as low as 1,000 breeding pairs. To put that in perspective, there are more people in a single apartment building in Manhattan than there were humans in the entire world during our species' darkest hour. We came that close to joining our extinct cousins. We were hanging by a thread so thin that a single natural disaster, a bad winter, or a disease outbreak could have ended the human story entirely. But we didn't just barely survive once. The genetic evidence suggests we went through multiple bottlenecks, multiple near-extinction events that culled our population down to dangerously small numbers. Each time, we clawed our way back, but each time we lost something irreplaceable: genetic diversity, cultural knowledge, different ways of being human. And here's what makes this discovery so chilling. We're still living with the consequences of those ancient bottlenecks. Our lack of genetic diversity isn't just an interesting historical footnote. It's a current vulnerability that affects everything from our susceptibility to diseases to our ability to adapt to environmental changes. Most species maintain their genetic health through what biologists call outbreeding. They mate with individuals from distant populations, mixing different gene pools, maintaining the diversity that allows them to adapt to new challenges. But humans went through such severe bottlenecks that we've never fully recovered that diversity. We're all, in genetic terms, surprisingly closely related. Any 2 humans picked at random from anywhere in the world are more genetically similar than 2 chimpanzees from the same forest. We're living proof that our species went through an evolutionary near-death experience so severe that we're still carrying the scars. But it gets worse. Because while we were barely surviving these ancient bottlenecks, we were also eliminating the genetic diversity that existed in other human populations. Remember those Neanderthal and Denisovan genes we carry? They represent only a tiny fraction of the genetic diversity that once existed in the human family. When we absorbed our cousins through interbreeding, we didn't preserve their full genetic legacy. We kept maybe 1 to 4% of their DNA, the parts that happened to be useful for our survival, but we lost the rest. Entire genetic lineages that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years disappeared when their carriers died out. Imagine if we had access to the full genetic diversity of all the human species that once nations to environmental extremes that would allow us to survive existed. We might have natural resistance to diseases that devastate us today. We might have adapted physical traits that we can't even imagine because they were eliminated before we knew climate change more easily. We might have cognitive abilities, or they existed. Instead, we're stuck with the genetic legacy of a single surviving lineage, filtered through multiple near-extinction events that eliminated most of our original diversity. We're not the pinnacle of human evolution. We're the genetic remnant of a much richer, more diverse human family. And the pattern continues today in ways that mirror the ancient extinctions of our cousins. Because while there's only one human species left, there are still thousands of distinct human populations, each with their own genetic adaptations, cultural knowledge, and ways of life. And these populations are disappearing at an accelerating rate. Indigenous populations around the world are facing the same pressures that eliminated the Neanderthals and Denisovans: habitat loss, climate change, disease, and competition from expanding populations. But instead of different human species going extinct, it's different human cultures, languages, and knowledge systems. Every few weeks, another language dies with its last native speaker. When that happens, we don't just lose words, we lose unique ways of understanding the world, traditional ecological knowledge that took thousands of years to develop, alternative approaches to medicine, agriculture, and social organization. The Inuit have dozens of words for different types of snow and ice, knowledge that's essential for surviving in Arctic environments. Australian Aboriginal peoples have songlines that encode detailed maps of water sources across thousands of miles of desert. Traditional healers in the Amazon have encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal plants that could revolutionize modern medicine. But these knowledge systems are disappearing as fast as we can document them. Young people move to cities, adopt globalized lifestyles, and the old ways are forgotten. It's cultural extinction happening in real time, and it's following the same patterns that drove our biological cousins to extinction. The forces are different now. Instead of climate change and disease, it's economic pressure and technological change. Instead of demographic absorption through interbreeding, it's cultural absorption through globalization. But the result is the same: the elimination of diversity, the consolidation of human ways of life into fewer and fewer surviving variants. And just like the biological extinctions of our cousins, these cultural extinctions are irreversible. Once a language dies, once traditional knowledge is lost, once a unique way of being human disappears, it's gone forever. We can't resurrect a dead culture any more than we can resurrect a dead species. But here's what makes our current situation even more precarious than our ancient bottlenecks. This time, we're not just losing diversity, we're becoming dependent on systems that are themselves incredibly fragile. Our global civilization is built on fossil fuels, complex supply chains, and interconnected technologies that could all be disrupted by relatively small changes. A solar flare could knock out our electrical grids. A pandemic could shut down global trade. Climate change could make large parts of the world uninhabitable. Unlike our ancestors who lived in small self-sufficient groups that could survive independently, we've created a single, global civilization that's utterly dependent on its own complexity. If that system fails, we don't have backup plans. We don't have alternative ways of life to fall back on. We've essentially put all of humanity's eggs in one basket, and that basket, for all its current success, might be more fragile than we realize. Because complexity, as our extinct cousins learned, can be a vulnerability as well as a strength. The Neanderthals were perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe, but their specialization made them vulnerable when conditions changed. We're perfectly adapted to a stable, fossil fuel-powered global economy, but our specialization might make us vulnerable to disruptions we haven't anticipated. And unlike the gradual extinctions of our ancient cousins, a collapse of global civilization could happen much faster. We've created systems that are so interconnected that failures can cascade rapidly across the entire network. A problem that starts in one region can spread worldwide in days or weeks, not the thousands of years it took for our cousins to disappear. This isn't science fiction or doomsday paranoia. It's a realistic assessment of the risks we face as a highly interconnected, highly specialized global civilization. We've traded resilience for efficiency, diversity for unity, and we might have made ourselves more vulnerable in the process. But here's the thing about bottlenecks. They're not just about survival, they're also about evolution. Every time our species has faced near extinction, we've emerged different than we were before. The survivors of ancient bottlenecks weren't just lucky, they were often the ones who had traits that helped them adapt to changing conditions. The question is, What traits will help us survive the bottlenecks we're creating for ourselves today? And are we selecting for those traits, or are we selecting against them? Our current global culture rewards short-term thinking, consumption, and specialization. We celebrate people who can make money quickly, not people who can survive long-term environmental challenges. We value technological innovation over traditional ecological knowledge. We prioritize economic growth over sustainability. These might not be the traits that will help us survive the next bottleneck. In fact, they might be the traits that create the next bottleneck. And if we're not careful, we might find ourselves facing the same extinction pressures that eliminated our cousins, but without the diversity and resilience that allowed our ancestors to survive previous crises. The difference is that this time we know what's happening. We can see the patterns, understand the risks, and potentially change course before it's too late. We have something our extinct cousins never had: the ability to learn from their extinctions and consciously choose a different path, but that requires admitting something uncomfortable, that our current success might not be sustainable, that our current way of life might be leading us toward the same dead end that claimed our cousins, and it requires doing something even more difficult: changing course while we still can. Because the alternative isn't just our own extinction, it's the end of the last lineage that remembers what it was like when humans were diverse, when the world was full of different ways of being human, when survival required wisdom rather than just technology. We are the children of bottlenecks, the descendants of survivors who made it through impossible odds. But survival isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing process, a constant adaptation to changing conditions. And the conditions are changing faster now than they ever have before. The question isn't whether we'll face another bottleneck. The question is whether we'll be ready for it when it comes. Whether we'll have preserved enough diversity, enough resilience, enough wisdom to make it through. Whether we'll learn from the extinctions of our cousins, or whether we'll join them in the fossil record, because evolution is still happening, selection is still operating, and the traits that determine survival are still being tested every day. The only difference is that now, for the first time in human history, we're conscious participants in that process. We can choose what kind of humans we want to be, what traits we want to preserve, what future we want to create. But we have to choose quickly, because bottlenecks don't announce themselves in advance. They just happen suddenly and without warning, and by the time you realize you're in one, it's usually too late to prepare. The extinction of our human cousins isn't just ancient history, it's a preview of what could happen to us if we're not careful, and the fact that we're the only humans left doesn't make us safe. It makes us responsible for carrying forward the entire legacy of human evolution. We owe it to our extinct cousins and to our future descendants to do better than just survive. We owe it to them to thrive, to preserve diversity, to maintain the resilience that allowed our species to make left. But that doesn't mean we have different ways of being human that still exist, and to make sure that the future it this far, because we may be the only humans before we join them in extinction ourselves. Only the diversity that remains to protect they of our species is as rich and varied as our past once was, but only to stay alone. We can choose to preserve if we act while we still have time. Only if we learn from the extinctions of our cousins and a responsibility that we can't afford, that being the last humans left is both a privilege, if we remember that survival isn't guaranteed, and to waste. The thing about being alone is that you don't always realize it until it's too late, and by the time you understand what you've lost, the silence has already settled in so completely that you can't imagine what it was like before. We've spent this entire journey looking at our extinct cousins, trying to understand how we became the last humans standing. But there's another question we haven't really confronted, one that might be even more important. What does it actually mean to be alone? And are we handling that responsibility well? Because here's something that should keep you awake at night. The same forces that eliminated our human cousins are still operating today. Not on other human species, because there aren't any left, but on the diversity that remains within our own species. We're still in the process of becoming the only humans left, just in a different way. Think about it like this. When the last Neanderthal died in that cave in Gibraltar 28,000 years ago, they weren't just an individual passing away. They were the end of an entire way of being human. A way of thinking, of organising society, of relating to the environment that had worked successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. All of that knowledge, all of that accumulated wisdom died with them. Today, we're watching the same thing happen, just more subtly. Every time an indigenous language disappears, we lose unique ways of categorizing the world, of understanding relationships between humans and nature, of organizing social life, that if a language dies, they take with them not just words, but took thousands of years to develop. When the last speaker cognitive frameworks that we can never recover. The Kawascar people of Chile have a word, mami hlapina tapai, that describes the wordless, meaningful look shared by two people who both desire to initiate something, but are both reluctant to start. English has no equivalent. When that language dies, we don't just lose a word. We lose a concept, a way of understanding human interaction that English speakers literally cannot express. The Piraha people of the Amazon have no words for exact numbers beyond 2. Their language has no past or art, no recursive language structures that most linguists consider fundamental future tense, only present. They have no creation myths, no abstract to human cognition, but they're perfectly adapted to their environment, with incredibly sophisticated ecological knowledge and social structures that work beautifully for their way of life. What happens when that language dies? When those children grow up speaking Portuguese or English instead? We don't just lose vocabulary, we lose an entire alternative approach to human consciousness, a different way of organising thought that might hold insights we desperately need. And this is happening everywhere, all the time. According to UNESCO, a language dies approximately every 2 weeks. That means that by the time you finish watching this video, we'll be measurably closer to linguistic extinction than when you started. We're eliminating human diversity at a rate that would make our ancient extinctions look slow. But it's not just languages, it's entire knowledge systems. Traditional ecological knowledge that allowed people to live sustainably in specific environments for thousands of years is disappearing as those people are forced to abandon their ancestral lands or adopt modern lifestyles. The Inuit have traditional knowledge about ice conditions that's more accurate than satellite data for predicting weather patterns in the Arctic. Aboriginal Australians have fire management techniques that could help prevent the catastrophic wildfires that are becoming more common due to climate change. Traditional farmers in the Andes have developed potato varieties that can grow in conditions that would kill modern commercial crops. But this knowledge isn't written down in textbooks. It's embedded in cultures, in languages, in ways of life that are disappearing. When those cultures die, the knowledge dies with them. And unlike our extinct cousins, we're doing this to ourselves, consciously choosing short-term convenience over long-term wisdom. Here's what makes this particularly tragic. Our extinct cousins disappeared because they couldn't adapt fast enough to changing conditions. But we're eliminating diversity at the exact moment when we need it most. Climate change, environmental degradation, social inequality, these are all problems that require innovative solutions. But instead of preserving the full range of human approaches to these challenges, we're systematically eliminating alternatives in favour of a single, globalised way of life. It's like we learned the wrong lesson from the extinction of our cousins. Instead of concluding that diversity is essential for survival, we concluded that unity is strength. Instead of preserving different approaches to being human, we're trying to perfect a single approach. And that might be the most dangerous mistake our species has ever made. Because here's the thing about evolutionary bottlenecks. They don't just eliminate individuals, they eliminate options. Every time our species has gone through a near-extinction event, we've emerged more genetically uniform, more culturally homogeneous, more dependent on a smaller range of survival strategies. Our ancient bottlenecks eliminated most of our genetic diversity. Our historical bottlenecks eliminated most of our linguistic diversity. And our current bottleneck, the one we're creating through globalization and modernization, is eliminating most of our cultural diversity. We're voluntarily putting ourselves through the same process that nearly drove us extinct multiple times in the past. And we're doing it at exactly the moment when we face challenges that might require every bit of human wisdom and ingenuity we can muster. Climate change isn't just an environmental problem, it's an evolutionary test. It's asking whether our species has the diversity, the flexibility, the wisdom to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And our answer so far has been to eliminate diversity in favour of efficiency, to choose short-term growth over long-term sustainability, to value technological solutions over traditional wisdom. That might work. Our globalized, technology-dependent civilization might successfully navigate climate change and the other challenges we face. But if it doesn't, we won't have backup plans. We won't have alternative approaches to fall back on. We'll have put all our eggs in one basket, just like our extinct cousins did. The Neanderthals were perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe until the climate changed. We're perfectly adapted to a stable, resource-rich global economy. But what happens when that stability disappears? What happens when our complex supply chains break down? When our energy sources become unavailable? When our technological solutions stop working? We've created a civilization that's incredibly powerful, but also incredibly fragile. And we've made ourselves so dependent on that civilization that we've forgotten how to live without it. We've eliminated the very diversity that might allow us to survive if our current approach fails. But here's what gives me hope. Even in the face of all this, we're not unconscious participants in this process. Unlike our extinct cousins, we can see what's happening. We can understand the patterns, recognize the risks, and potentially change course. For the first time in human history, we have the knowledge and the tools to consciously preserve diversity instead of eliminating it. We can document languages before they die. We can record traditional ecological knowledge. We can protect indigenous cultures and their ways of life. We can choose to maintain multiple approaches to being human instead of converging on a single model. We can value sustainability over growth, wisdom over efficiency, resilience over optimization. We can learn from our extinct cousins instead of repeating their mistakes, but only if we act quickly. Because the forces that drove our cousins to extinction are still operating, and they're accelerating. Globalization, urbanization, technological change, these processes are moving faster than our extinct cousins ever had to deal with. We might not have the luxury of thousands of years to adapt. The question is whether we'll use our consciousness, our knowledge of evolutionary history, our understanding of extinction patterns to make better choices than our cousins did. Whether we'll preserve the diversity we have left instead of eliminating it in pursuit of efficiency, because being the only human species left isn't just a fact about our current situation. It's a responsibility. We're the trustees of the entire human evolutionary legacy. We carry in our genes, our cultures, our languages, the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of human experience. Our extinct cousins trusted us with their legacy when they interbred with our ancestors and passed on fragments of their DNA. Indigenous cultures are trusting us with their legacy when they share their knowledge with researchers and anthropologists. Future generations are trusting us to preserve the options they might need to survive challenges we can't even imagine yet. We can honour that trust, or we can betray it. We can preserve diversity, or we can eliminate it. We can learn from extinction, or we can repeat it. The choice is ours, but we have to make it soon, because evolution is still happening. Selection is still operating. The traits that determine survival are still being tested every day, And right now, we're selecting for traits that value short-term success over long-term survival, uniformity over diversity, growth over sustainability. Those might not be the traits that will help us survive the next bottleneck. In fact, they might be the traits that create the next bottleneck. And if we're not careful, if we don't learn from the extinctions of our cousins, we might find ourselves facing the same fate they did. But we don't have to. We can choose differently. We can value the diversity that remains. We can preserve the knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop. We can maintain multiple approaches to being human instead of converging last humans left. We're the carriers of everyone who came before us, the inheritors of their struggles, their innovations, their hard-won wisdom about how to survive on a single model. We can remember that we're not just in a dangerous and unpredictable world, and maybe if we're wise enough and humble enough to learn from their extinctions, we can make sure that their legacy and ours continues. Not just as a single uniform species, but as a diverse, resilient, adaptable family of humans who remember where we came from and take responsibility for where we're going. Because the story of human extinction isn't over, it's still being written, and for the first time in that long, strange story, we get to choose how it ends. The extinction of our cousins teaches us that nothing is permanent, nothing is guaranteed, and even the most successful species can vanish if they stop adapting to a changing world. But it also teaches us something else, that survival is possible, even against impossible odds, if you maintain enough diversity, enough flexibility, enough wisdom to keep changing when the world changes around you. We are the proof that survival is possible. We are the descendants of the lucky ones, the flexible ones, the ones who made it through every bottleneck and crisis that eliminated everyone else. But that legacy comes with a responsibility to make sure we don't become the next ones to disappear. We may be the only humans left, but we don't have to stay alone. We can preserve the diversity within our own species. We can protect the different ways of being human that still exist. We can learn from our extinct cousins and make sure their story and ours continues. But only if we remember that survival isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing process, a constant adaptation to changing conditions. And the conditions are changing faster now than they ever have before. The question isn't whether we'll face another bottleneck. The question is whether we'll be ready for it when it comes, whether we'll have preserved enough diversity, enough resilience, enough wisdom to make it through, whether we'll honour the memory of our extinct cousins by learning from their extinctions, or whether we'll join them in the silence that follows when the last voice of a species goes quiet forever. The choice, for now, is still ours. But time is running out, and the silence is getting louder. We are the only humans left, but we don't have to stay alone. We just have to choose diversity over uniformity, wisdom over efficiency, long-term thinking over short-term gain. We have to choose to survive, not just as individuals, but as a species rich enough and diverse enough to carry the legacy of everyone who came before us into whatever future awaits. Because in the end, that's what being the only humans left really means. Not that we won some ancient competition, but that we inherited a responsibility we can't afford to waste. The responsibility to remember, to preserve, to adapt, and to make sure that when future archaeologists dig up our bones, they'll find evidence of a species that learned from extinction instead of repeating it. A species that chose to thrive instead of just survive. A species that remembered its cousins and made sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. That's our choice, that's our challenge, and that's our hope. But here's where the story gets really disturbing, and I mean genuinely unsettling in a way that should make you question everything you think you know about human nature. Because we didn't just accidentally outlive our cousins, we might have actively participated in their disappearance, not through some grand conspiracy or deliberate genocide, but through something much more subtle and perhaps more terrifying. We might have been an invasive species. Think about what happens when you introduce a new animal to an ecosystem that's never seen it before. Take rabbits in Australia, or zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, or pythons in the Everglades. These aren't evil animals plotting to destroy their new homes. They're just doing what evolution programmed them to do: survive, reproduce, and spread. But because they evolved somewhere else, they don't fit into the existing balance. They exploit resources in ways the native species can't compete with. They reproduce faster, adapt quicker, and gradually crowd out the locals who've been there for millions of years. Now imagine that happening, but with humans. Homo sapiens, having evolved in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly expanding into territories that had been home to other human species for even longer. We weren't necessarily better than them, but we were different. We had different strategies, different social structures, different ways of exploiting resources, and those differences, accumulated over thousands of years, might have given us just enough of an edge to slowly, inexorably push our cousins toward extinction. The archaeological evidence for this is subtle but chilling. When you map the spread of modern humans out of Africa, you see a pattern that follows classic, invasive species behaviour. We moved into new territories in waves, established beachheads, then gradually expanded our range. And wherever we went, the archaeological signatures of other human species began to fade. It wasn't immediate replacement. That would have left clear evidence of conflict, of sudden population crashes, of dramatic cultural disruption. Instead, it was gradual displacement, the kind you see when one species slowly outcompetes another over generations. The other humans didn't disappear overnight. They just became less common, more scattered, more vulnerable to the random disasters that can wipe out small populations. Take the Levant, that crucial corridor between Africa and the rest of Eurasia. For tens of thousands of years, it was home to both Neanderthals and early modern humans, sometimes alternating in the same caves, sometimes living in adjacent valleys. The archaeological record shows this complex dance of occupation and abandonment, with different human species using the same landscapes at different times. But if you look at the pattern over millennia, a trend emerges. Modern human sites become more common and more permanent. Neanderthal sites become rarer and more temporary. It's like watching a slow-motion competition where one team gradually gains ground while the other loses it, not through any single decisive victory, but through 1,000 small advantages that compound over time. And those advantages weren't necessarily what you'd expect. We weren't smarter in any simple sense. Neanderthal brains were actually larger than ours on average. They weren't technologically inferior. Some of their tools were more sophisticated than anything we were making at the time. They weren't poorly adapted to their environments. They'd been successfully living in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. But we had something they didn't. What anthropologists call behavioural modernity. Not superior intelligence, but cognitive flexibility. The ability to rapidly innovate, to adapt our behaviour to new situations, to form larger and more complex social networks. We were the generalists in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Think about it this way. The Neanderthals were like master craftsmen who had perfected their trade over centuries. They knew exactly how to make the best tools for hunting reindeer in glacial valleys. They understood their environments so intimately that they could predict where game would be, when plants would ripen, how to survive the harshest winters. But we were like entrepreneurs, always experimenting with new approaches, always ready to pivot when conditions changed. When the old hunting grounds became less productive, we found new ones. When traditional tools stopped working, we invented new ones. When our small groups became too isolated, we developed networks to connect with distant relatives. In a stable world, the Neanderthal approach might have been superior. Deep local knowledge, time-tested traditions, and tight-knit communities are incredibly valuable when you can predict what challenges you'll face. But the world they lived in wasn't stable. Climate was changing, landscapes were shifting, and new pressures were emerging from the south in the form of us. And we brought more than just competition for resources. We brought something potentially more devastating: our diseases. When populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly come back into contact, the microbial exchange can be catastrophic for the group that hasn't built up immunities to the other's pathogens. We see this pattern throughout human history. When Europeans reached the Americas, diseases like smallpox and measles devastated native populations who had no natural resistance. The Black Death killed a third of Europe when it arrived from Asia. Even today, isolated populations can be wiped out by diseases that cause nothing more than a cold in people who grew up with them. Now imagine this happening in slow motion over tens of thousands of years. Every time modern humans expanded into a new region, every time we came into contact with our cousins, we may have been carrying invisible biological weapons that we didn't even know we possessed. African diseases that we'd lived with for millennia, pathogens that our immune systems had learned to handle, but that could be deadly to populations that had never encountered them. The genetic evidence supports this grim possibility. Modern humans today carry immune system genes that we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans. Why would we need their immune adaptations if they were already extinct when we arrived? The most logical explanation is that we encountered them while they were still alive, interbred with them, and inherited their disease resistances because we needed them to survive the pathogens they carried. But here's the crucial asymmetry. We inherited their immunities, but they may not have inherited all of ours. If African disease loads were higher or more diverse than those in other regions, then contact with us could have been devastating for our cousins while being merely challenging for us. This isn't speculation. We can see similar patterns in the archaeological record. In Europe, there's a clear correlation between the arrival of modern humans and the decline of Neanderthal populations. Not immediate replacement, but gradual demographic shift. Populations that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly start showing signs of stress, fragmentation, and eventual disappearance. But disease was probably just one factor in a complex process that played out differently in different places. In some regions, climate change may have been the primary driver, creating environmental pressures that favoured our more flexible survival strategies. In others, direct competition for resources may have been more important, with our larger social networks and more diverse toolkits giving us advantages in exploiting local ecosystems. And then there's the most uncomfortable possibility of all, that we didn't just outcompete our cousins, we absorbed them. The genetic evidence shows that interbreeding between modern humans and other human species was more common than scientists initially thought. But this mixing wasn't necessarily friendly or consensual. When one population is expanding and another is contracting, genetic exchange often reflects the power dynamics of that relationship. Population geneticists have a term for this: demographic absorption. It's what happens when a smaller, declining population gradually gets incorporated into a larger, expanding one through intermarriage and cultural assimilation. Over time, the distinct identity of the smaller group disappears, even though some of their genes survive in the larger population. It's not genocide in the violent sense that we usually think about, but it's still the elimination of a unique way of being human. And it may be exactly what happened to our cousins. Not a sudden conquest, but a slow dissolution as their populations dwindled and their young people increasingly paired with members of the expanding modern human population. This process leaves a very specific signature in the genetic record, and it's exactly what we see when we analyse ancient DNA from the contact zones where different human species met. Asymmetric gene flow, with more genes moving from the declining population into the expanding one than the reverse. Evidence of interbreeding that increases over time as the smaller population becomes more isolated and has fewer mating options within its own group.
Right.
It's a pattern that's played out throughout human history, and it's still playing out today. Indigenous populations around the world are facing similar pressures from expanding global cultures. Not violent conquest, but demographic and cultural absorption that gradually erases distinct ways of life, even as some genetic heritage persists. But here's what makes our case unique and uniquely troubling. When modern humans expanded out of Africa, we weren't just another population competing for resources. We were something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species that could rapidly alter its own behavior, and in doing so, alter entire ecosystems. Everywhere we went, we left a trail of ecological disruption. Large animals went extinct at rates far above background levels. Fire patterns changed as we used controlled burning to manage landscapes. Plant communities shifted as we preferentially harvested certain species while avoiding others. We weren't just adapting to environments, we were transforming them. Our human cousins, who had co-evolved with these ecosystems over hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly found themselves in landscapes that no longer operated according to the rules they'd learned. The traditional knowledge that had allowed them to thrive for millennia became less reliable as we altered the fundamental ecology of their homelands. This wasn't malicious. We were just doing what humans do, modifying our environment to better suit our needs. But the cumulative effect was to create ecological conditions that favoured our flexible, opportunistic survival strategies, while disadvantaging the more specialised approaches that our cousins had perfected. Think of it like introducing a new technology that makes all the old ways of doing things obsolete. The craftsmen who spent decades perfecting traditional techniques suddenly find themselves unemployed, not because they lack skill, but because the market has changed in ways they couldn't predict or control. That may be what happened to our human cousins. They weren't eliminated by superior competitors so much as they were made obsolete by environmental changes they couldn't adapt to quickly enough. And we were the primary driver of those changes, not through any conscious plan, but simply by being ourselves, in landscapes that had never experienced our particular brand of human behaviour. The most tragic part of this story is that our cousins probably never understood what was happening to them. Extinction, when it happens gradually over many generations, is invisible to the people experiencing it. Each generation might notice that there seem to be fewer children than there used to be, that some of the traditional camping sites aren't being used anymore, that it's getting harder to find marriage partners outside the immediate family, but they wouldn't have connected these local problems to the broader pattern of a species in decline. They wouldn't have known that similar struggles were playing out in Neanderthal populations across Europe, or that Denisovan groups in Asia were facing the same demographic pressures. They would have experienced their extinction as a series of personal tragedies and local difficulties, not as the end of an entire way of being human. And that brings us to the most unsettling question of all. Are we still doing it? Are we still in the process of eliminating human diversity, just more subtly than our ancestors did? Today, there's only one human species, but there are still thousands of different human cultures, each with their own languages, traditions, and ways of understanding the world. But these cultures are disappearing at a rate that makes the extinction of our biological cousins look slow and gentle by comparison. Languages die out every few weeks. Traditional ways of life are abandoned as people move to cities and adopt globalized lifestyles. Indigenous knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop are being lost faster than we can document them. We're witnessing cultural extinction happening in real time, and it's following exactly the same patterns that eliminated our biological cousins. The forces are different now. Instead of climate change and disease, it's economic pressure and technological disruption. Instead of demographic absorption through interbreeding, it's cultural absorption through globalization and urbanization. But the result is the same: the elimination of diversity, the consolidation of human ways of life into fewer and fewer surviving variants. And just like the biological extinctions of our cousins, these cultural extinctions are largely invisible to the people causing them. We're not deliberately trying to eliminate linguistic diversity or destroy traditional knowledge systems. We're just pursuing economic development, technological progress, and individual opportunity. But the cumulative effect is to create conditions that make traditional ways of life unsustainable while favoring globalized, urbanized lifestyles. The Kaweskar people of Chile, the Piraha of the Amazon, the Inuit of the Arctic, they're facing the same pressures that eliminated the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Not violent conquest, but gradual displacement, as their traditional territories are transformed by outside forces, as their young people adopt new lifestyles, as their languages become less useful for navigating a changing world. We like to think we're more civilized than our ancestors, that we've moved beyond the crude competitions that drove our cousins to extinction. But maybe we're just more subtle about it. Maybe we've perfected the art of elimination through absorption, of making diversity disappear, not through violence, but through irresistible economic and cultural pressure. And maybe, if we're honest about it, we have to admit that being the only humans left isn't just a historical accident. Maybe it's an ongoing process, one that we're still participating in every time we choose efficiency over diversity, progress over preservation, growth over sustainability, because the pattern that eliminated our biological cousins hasn't stopped. It's just shifted targets. We're still the invasive species, still the expanding population that crowds out alternatives, still the force that transforms environments in ways that make traditional adaptations obsolete. The difference is that now, for the first time, we're conscious of what we're doing. We can see the patterns, understand the consequences, and potentially choose a different path. We can decide to preserve diversity instead of eliminating it, to protect alternatives instead of absorbing them, to value the wisdom of different approaches instead of assuming that our way is the only way. But only if we're willing to admit that we're still the same species that eliminated our cousins. Only if we're honest about the fact that our success has often come at the expense of others. Only if we're humble enough to recognize that being the only humans left isn't necessarily something to be proud of. Because in the end, the extinction of our cousins isn't just a story about the deep past. It's a mirror reflecting who we are today, what we're still doing, and what we might become if we don't learn to live with diversity instead of eliminating it. We are the descendants of survivors, but we're also the descendants of a process that eliminated every other way of being human. And that legacy, that responsibility, is something we carry with us every day, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is, what are we going to do with it? The question is, what are we going to do with it? But before we can answer that, we need to confront something even more uncomfortable, something that challenges everything we like to believe about human progress, about civilization, about our place in the natural order. Because the more we study the extinction of our cousins, the more we realize that we might not be the triumphant endpoint of evolution that we pretend to be. We might be something much stranger and more disturbing, an evolutionary mistake that got lucky. Think about it this way. For the vast majority of life's history on Earth, diversity has been the winning strategy. When asteroids hit, when climates shift, when ecosystems collapse, the species that survive are usually the ones that had spread their bets across multiple approaches to life. Dinosaurs dominated the planet for 165 million years, not because they found one perfect way to be a reptile, but because they found hundreds of different ways. Small ones, giant ones, meat-eaters, plant-eaters, flyers, swimmers, burrowers. But humans took the opposite approach. We started with diversity and moved toward uniformity. We began as multiple species with different strategies for survival, and we ended up as a single species with an increasingly narrow range of approaches to life. In evolutionary terms, that's not normally a sign of success, that's a sign of a lineage heading toward a dead end. Most successful animal groups maintain their diversity over millions of years. There are still dozens of species of cats, hundreds of species of birds, thousands of species of beetles. But there's only one species of human, and that human species is becoming more genetically and culturally uniform with each passing generation. We've essentially done the opposite of what evolution usually rewards. Instead of diversifying to fill different ecological niches, we've homogenized. Instead of spreading risk across multiple approaches, we've put all our eggs in one basket. Instead of maintaining the flexibility that comes from having many different solutions to life's problems, we've standardized on a single approach that might not work if conditions change, and conditions are changing rapidly in ways that our ancestors never had to deal with. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, technological disruption. These are challenges that might require exactly the kind of diversity we've been eliminating. But instead of preserving different approaches to these problems, we've been systematically destroying alternatives in favor of a single, globalized way of life. It's like we learnt the wrong lesson from our own success. We survived when our cousins didn't, so we concluded that our approach was superior. But what if we survived not because our approach was better, but because we were lucky? What if the conditions that favoured our particular survival strategy were temporary, and we've been doubling down on a bet that's about to stop paying off? Consider the evidence. Our success as a species has been built on exploiting Earth's stored energy resources, fossil fuels that took millions of years to accumulate and that we're burning through in centuries. Our population growth has been enabled by an agricultural system that depletes soil, exhausts aquifers, and depends on chemical inputs that are becoming increasingly expensive to produce. Our economic system requires continuous growth on a finite planet, which is mathematically impossible over the long term. These aren't sustainable strategies. They're strategies that work for a while, in specific conditions, but that ultimately undermine their own foundations. And that's exactly the kind of evolutionary trap that our extinct cousins fell into. They became so perfectly adapted to specific conditions that they couldn't survive when those conditions changed. The Neanderthals were incredibly well adapted to Ice Age Europe. Their bodies, their tools, their social structures, everything about them was optimized for that particular environment. But when the climate started changing, when new competitors arrived, when the ecological rules they'd learned no longer applied, their specialization became a liability. Are we making the same mistake? Have we become so perfectly adapted to a world of cheap energy, stable climate, and abundant resources that we can't survive without them? Have we eliminated so many alternatives, so many different approaches to being human, that we've lost the flexibility we need to adapt to changing conditions? The uncomfortable answer might be yes. And if that's true, then our extinction of our cousins wasn't a triumph. It was a preview of our own potential extinction. We eliminated diversity just when we might have needed it most, and now we're facing challenges that might require exactly the kind of alternative approaches we destroyed. But here's where the story gets even darker, because there's another pattern in our evolutionary history that we haven't talked about yet. Something that suggests our current dominance might be more fragile than we realise, and our future more uncertain than we like to admit. Every time our species has faced a major crisis, we've responded by becoming less diverse, not more diverse. Every bottleneck has made us more genetically uniform, more culturally homogeneous, more dependent on a narrower range of survival strategies. And each time, we've told ourselves that this consolidation made us stronger, more efficient, better adapted. But what if it's actually made us more vulnerable? What if each bottleneck has been eliminating exactly the diversity we'll need to survive the next crisis? What if we're caught in a cycle where each success makes the next failure more likely? Look at what happened during our expansion out of Africa. We started as one of several human species, each with different approaches to survival. By the time we finished spreading across the globe, we were the only human species left. We'd eliminated all the alternatives, all the different ways of being human that had evolved over millions of years. Then we went through the agricultural revolution. We started with thousands of different hunter-gatherer cultures, each adapted to specific local environments, each with unique knowledge about how to live sustainably in their particular ecosystem. By the time agriculture was established, most of these cultures were gone, replaced by a much smaller number of farming societies that were more productive, but also more vulnerable to climate change, disease, and social collapse. Then we went through the Industrial Revolution. We started with hundreds of different agricultural societies, each with distinct approaches to organizing social life, managing resources, and relating to the natural world. By the time industrialization was complete, most of these alternatives had been eliminated in favor of a single model based on fossil fuel extraction, mass production, and continuous growth. And now we're going through the digital revolution, the globalization revolution, the technological revolution. Once again, we're eliminating diversity in favor of efficiency, local knowledge in favor of standardized solutions, traditional wisdom in favor of technological innovation. Each time, we tell ourselves we're progressing, evolving, becoming more advanced. But from an evolutionary perspective, we're doing exactly what our extinct cousins did, becoming more specialized, more dependent on specific conditions, less able to survive if those conditions change. The pattern is clear, but its implications are terrifying. Because if we're right about our cousins, if they went extinct because they became too specialized to adapt to changing conditions, then we might be heading toward the same fate. We might be in the process of eliminating the very diversity we'll need to survive the challenges that are coming. Climate change isn't just an environmental problem, it's an evolutionary test, asking whether our species has maintained enough flexibility, enough diversity, enough alternative approaches to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And our response so far has been to eliminate alternatives in favor of technological solutions, to standardize approaches instead of preserving variety, to put all our faith in a single model of how humans should live. That might work. Our technological civilization might successfully navigate climate change and all the other challenges we're facing. But if it doesn't, we won't have backup plans. We won't have alternative approaches to fall back on. We'll have done to ourselves what we did to our cousins, eliminated diversity just when we needed it most. And there's another pattern that's even more disturbing. Each time we've gone through one of these consolidation events, we've become more dependent on complex systems that are themselves fragile. Our ancestors were vulnerable to local disasters, but they were resilient to global ones because they were spread out, diverse, self-sufficient. We're the opposite, resilient to local disasters, but vulnerable to global ones because we're interconnected, standardized, dependent on systems that could fail simultaneously across the entire planet. A solar flare could knock out our electrical grids worldwide. A pandemic could shut down global trade and travel. A financial crisis could cascade through our interconnected economic systems. A cyber attack could disable the digital networks we depend on for everything from food distribution to medical care. Our ancestors faced these kinds of existential threats as local problems. A drought might wipe out one group, but it wouldn't affect people living a few hundred miles away. A disease might devastate one population, but it wouldn't spread to isolated communities. A social collapse might destroy one civilization, but it wouldn't impact others that had developed independently. We've traded that resilience for efficiency, that independence for specialization, that diversity for power. And in doing so, we may have made ourselves more vulnerable than any human population has ever been. Because when our systems fail, they don't fail locally. They fail globally, simultaneously, catastrophically. That's what happened to our cousins in slow motion. They became so dependent on specific ecological conditions, so specialized in their approaches to survival, that when those conditions changed, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. Their specialization, which had been their strength, became their weakness. Are we making the same mistake on a global scale? Have we become so dependent on technological solutions, so specialized in our approaches to survival, that we can't adapt when those approaches stop working? Have we eliminated so much diversity that we've lost the flexibility we need to survive disruption? The evidence suggests we might have, and if that's true, then the extinction of our cousins isn't just ancient history. It's a preview of what might happen to us if we don't learn to value diversity over efficiency, resilience over optimization, multiple approaches over single solutions. Because in the end, evolution doesn't care about our technology, our intelligence, or our cultural achievements. Evolution only cares about survival and reproduction over the long term. And the long-term survival strategy that evolution has consistently favored throughout the history of life is diversity, not specialization, multiple approaches, not single solutions, flexibility, not optimization. We survived this long by being flexible, adaptive, diverse, but we're systematically eliminating those very qualities in pursuit of efficiency, standardization, and control. We're doing to ourselves what we did to our cousins, narrowing our options just when we might need them most. The question is whether we can recognize this pattern and change course before it's too late, whether we can learn to preserve diversity instead of eliminating it, to maintain multiple approaches instead of standardizing on single solutions, to value resilience over efficiency. Because if we can't, if we continue down the path of consolidation and specialization, then we might discover that being the only humans left isn't a victory. It's just the final stage before joining our cousins in extinction. And this time, there won't be anyone else to carry on the human story. This time, when the last human dies, the entire lineage dies with them. No cousins to continue the experiment, no alternatives to fall back on, no diversity to ensure that some version of humanity survives whatever catastrophe finally overwhelms our specialized, fragile, interconnected civilization. We are the only humans left, but we don't have to stay alone. We can choose to preserve the diversity that remains, to protect the different ways of being human that still exist, to maintain the flexibility that allowed our species to survive every previous crisis. But we have to choose quickly, because the patterns that eliminated our cousins are accelerating, and time is running out to preserve the alternatives we might need to survive whatever comes next. The extinction of our cousins teaches us that survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. It's about maintaining enough diversity, enough flexibility, enough different approaches to life that some version of your species can survive whatever changes the world throws at you. We forgot that lesson when we eliminated our cousins. We're forgetting it again as we eliminate cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, and alternative approaches to human civilization. The question is whether we can remember it before it's too late, whether we can learn from extinction instead of repeating it, whether we can choose to be the species that preserved diversity instead of the species that eliminated it, because in the end, that might be the only choice that matters. Not whether we progress or regress, advance or retreat, but whether we survive or join our cousins in the silence that follows, when the last member of a species dies alone, with no one left to remember what they were or mourn what they might have become. We are the only humans left, but we don't have to be the last. We don't have to be the last, but here's the thing that should terrify you more than our own potential extinction. We might not even realize when it's happening, because extinction, real extinction, doesn't announce itself with sirens and breaking news alerts. It creeps up quietly, generation by generation, choice by choice, until one day you wake up and realize that something irreplaceable has disappeared forever. And we're already seeing the early signs, not of our biological extinction, not yet, but of something almost as profound: the extinction of human possibility itself. Let me paint you a picture of what I mean. Right now, today, there are languages dying that contain entire ways of understanding reality. The Piraha people of the Amazon think about time in ways that English literally cannot express. They have no past tense, no future tense, only an eternal present that shapes how they perceive causation, memory, and planning. When that language dies, and it probably will within our lifetimes, we don't just lose vocabulary. We lose an entire cognitive framework that took thousands of years to evolve. The Inuit have over 50 words for different types of snow and ice, each one encoding crucial survival knowledge about Arctic conditions. Climate change is melting their world. Globalization is pulling their children towards cities, and their language is disappearing. When it's gone, we'll lose not just words, but a sophisticated understanding of ice dynamics that could be crucial for understanding our changing planet. Australian Aboriginal peoples have songlines, musical maps that encode detailed information about water sources, seasonal changes, and navigation routes across thousands of miles of desert. These aren't primitive superstitions. They're sophisticated information storage systems that allowed people to survive in one of Earth's harshest environments for over 60,000 years. But the people who carry this knowledge are dying, and their children are learning pop songs instead of survival songs. This is happening everywhere, all the time. We're in the middle of the greatest extinction of human knowledge in history, and most of us don't even notice because it's happening quietly, one forgotten elder at a time. But it gets worse, because we're not just losing traditional knowledge, we're losing the cognitive diversity that makes our species adaptable. We're creating a world where everyone thinks the same way, values the same things, approaches problems with the same assumptions. We're voluntarily reducing ourselves to a monoculture, and monocultures are inherently unstable. Think about what happens to crops when you plant only one variety. Everything looks great for a while. You get maximum efficiency, predictable yields, easy management. But then single variety can't handle, and because some environmental pressure emerges that you're eliminated all the alternatives, because you've put a new disease comes along, or the climate shifts all your eggs in one genetic basket, everything dies at once. That's what we're doing to human culture. We're creating a global monoculture that's incredibly efficient in current conditions, but potentially catastrophic if those conditions change. And the conditions are changing rapidly in ways that our standardized approaches to life might not be able to handle. Climate change is just the beginning. We're also facing resource depletion, ecological collapse, social inequality, technological disruption, and challenges we haven't even imagined yet. And our response to all of these problems has been to double down on the same approaches that created them. More technology, more growth, more standardization, more centralization. We keep trying to solve 21st century problems with the same thinking that created them. But what if the solutions we need exist in the knowledge systems we're destroying? What if indigenous approaches to sustainable living, traditional ecological knowledge, alternative ways of organizing society, different concepts of time and value and meaning, what if these hold keys to survival that we're throwing away in our rush to modernize everything? The Kaweskar people of Chile had a word, mamihlapina tapai, that describes a specific type of meaningful look between two people who both want to initiate something but are both reluctant to start. There's no equivalent in English. When that language dies, we lose not just a word, but a concept, a way of understanding human communication that English-speaking people literally cannot express. How many other concepts are we losing? How many ways of understanding reality, processing emotion, organizing thought, relating to the natural world? How many potential solutions to problems we haven't even encountered yet? We're eliminating human diversity at exactly the moment when we need it most. It's like our ancestors burning their library just before the Dark Ages, except we're doing it voluntarily in the name of progress. And here's what makes it even more tragic. Unlike our extinct cousins, who disappeared because they couldn't adapt fast enough to changing conditions, we're eliminating alternatives before we even know whether we'll need them. We're making choices that reduce our future options based on the assumption that our current approach is not just good, but optimal, permanently optimal. But what if it's not? What if our technological civilization is just another evolutionary experiment, like the Neanderthals' specialization in Ice Age survival or the Denisovans' adaptation to high altitudes? What if it works for a while, in specific conditions, but ultimately proves unsustainable? The fossil record is littered with species that became incredibly successful by specializing in particular environments, only to go extinct when those environments changed. The saber-toothed cats were perfectly adapted for hunting large prey until the large prey disappeared. The giant ground sloths were supremely efficient at processing tough vegetation until the vegetation changed. The cave bears were masters of hibernation until the caves froze permanently. Are we the next specialists heading for extinction? Have we become so adapted to a world of cheap energy, stable climate, and abundant resources that we can't survive without them? Have we eliminated so many alternatives that we've lost the flexibility our species needs to navigate whatever comes next? The evidence is starting to suggest we might have. Our global civilization is incredibly powerful, but it's also incredibly fragile. It depends on complex supply chains that can be disrupted by single points of failure. It requires continuous inputs of energy and raw materials that are becoming harder to obtain. It generates waste and environmental damage that undermine its own foundations. And unlike traditional human societies, which were resilient because they were diverse and decentralized, our modern civilization is vulnerable because it's standardized and interconnected. When our systems fail, they don't fail locally. They fail globally, simultaneously, catastrophically. We saw a preview of this during the COVID pandemic. A single virus, not particularly deadly by historical standards, brought the entire global economy to a standstill. Supply chains collapsed, social systems buckled, and millions of people discovered just how dependent they were on complex networks they didn't understand and couldn't control. But COVID was a gentle warning compared to what's coming. Climate change will be more severe, more prolonged, more disruptive to the basic systems that our civilization depends on. And our response has been to make ourselves even more dependent on technology, even more centralized, even more vulnerable to systemic collapse. We're doing exactly what our extinct cousins did. We're doubling down on specialization just when we need flexibility most. We're eliminating diversity just when changing conditions require adaptive responses. We're putting all our eggs in one basket just when that basket is getting more and more precarious. But unlike our cousins, we can see what's happening. We have the knowledge, the historical perspective, the understanding of evolutionary patterns that could allow us to make different choices. We could choose to preserve diversity instead of eliminating it. We could choose to maintain multiple approaches instead of standardizing on single solutions. We could choose resilience over efficiency, sustainability over growth, wisdom over cleverness. But we're not making those choices. Instead, we're accelerating down the same path that led our cousins to extinction. We're eliminating alternatives, reducing options, narrowing possibilities, all in the name of progress and efficiency and optimization. And the most tragic part is that we're doing it voluntarily. Our cousins didn't choose to go extinct. They were victims of circumstances beyond their control: climate change, disease, competition from a more adaptable species. But we're choosing our path toward potential extinction. We're actively eliminating the diversity that could save us. Every time a language dies, we choose not to preserve it. Every time a traditional culture disappears, we choose not to support it. Every time an alternative approach to living is abandoned in favor of standardized modernity, we choose uniformity over diversity. These aren't inevitable processes, they're choices, and we could make different choices if we wanted to. We could value linguistic diversity as much as we value biodiversity. We could protect traditional knowledge as carefully as we protect historical artifacts. We could maintain multiple approaches to human civilization instead of forcing everyone into the same mold. But that would require admitting something uncomfortable, that our current way of life isn't the pinnacle of human achievement. That progress isn't always progressive. that newer isn't always better, that the people we're eliminating might know things we need to learn. It would require humility, and humility has never been our species' strong suit. We survived when our cousins didn't, so we assumed we were superior. We developed technology that gave us power over nature, so we assumed we were masters of our own destiny. We created wealth and comfort and convenience, so we assumed we had solved the fundamental problems of existence. But maybe we haven't solved anything. Maybe we've just postponed the reckoning. Maybe all we've done is create more complex versions of the same evolutionary traps that caught our cousins. Specialization that makes us vulnerable to change. Dependency that makes us fragile when systems fail. Overconfidence that blinds us to threats we haven't anticipated. The Neanderthals probably thought they had figured out how to live in Ice Age Europe. They'd been doing it successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. They had sophisticated tools, complex social structures, deep knowledge of their environment. They probably couldn't imagine anything that could threaten their way of life, but they were wrong. And we might be wrong too. Our civilization feels permanent because it's all we've known, but it's actually younger than some individual trees. We've been industrial for about 250 years, digital for about 50, globally connected for about 25. In evolutionary terms, we're still running an experiment, and we don't know how it ends. What we do know is that every previous human experiment eventually ended. The hunter-gatherer cultures that sustained our species for 200,000 years gave way to agricultural societies. The agricultural societies that seemed so stable and permanent were replaced by industrial ones, and industrial societies are already being transformed by digital technologies that might make them obsolete. Change is the only constant, but we keep acting as if our current approach is permanent, as if we've reached the end of history, as if we've found the final answer to how humans should live. And that assumption might be exactly what dooms us, just like it doomed our cousins. Because in the end, the species that survive aren't the ones that find perfect solutions. They're the ones that maintain enough diversity, enough flexibility, enough different approaches to life, that some version can adapt when conditions change. And conditions always change. We are the only humans left, but we don't have to stay alone in our thinking, our approaches, our ways of being human. We can choose to preserve the alternatives that remain, to protect the diversity that still exists, to maintain the flexibility that allowed our species to survive every previous crisis. But we have to choose soon, because the forces that eliminated our cousins are accelerating, and the alternatives are disappearing faster than we can document them. Each day that passes, each language that dies, each culture that vanishes, each traditional knowledge system that's abandoned, we become a little more like our extinct cousins, a little more specialized, a little more dependent, a little more vulnerable to the changes that are coming. The question isn't whether change will come. The question is whether we'll be ready for it, whether we'll have preserved enough diversity, enough alternatives, enough different ways of thinking about survival that some version of humanity can adapt and continue. We have the chance to be different from our cousins. We can see the patterns, understand the risks, make conscious choices about our future. We can choose diversity over uniformity, resilience over efficiency, wisdom over cleverness. But only if we act while we still have alternatives to preserve. Only if we choose to value what we're losing instead of just celebrating what we're gaining. Only if we remember that being the only humans left isn't a victory to be proud of, but a responsibility we can't afford to waste, because in the end, the greatest tragedy wouldn't be joining our cousins in extinction. It would be eliminating all the possibilities, all the alternatives, all the different ways of being human, and then discovering that we eliminated exactly what we needed to survive. We are the only humans left. But the story isn't over yet. We can still choose how it ends. We are the only humans left, but the story isn't over yet. We can still choose how it ends. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, and maybe should keep you awake too. What if we're not actually choosing anything? What if we're just passengers on a train that's been running on the same tracks for so long that we've forgotten there were ever other destinations. Because when you really look at it, when you strip away all the noise and distraction and self-congratulation, our species has been making the same choice over and over again for the past 70,000 years. Every time we've faced a fork in the road, every time we've encountered alternatives, every time we've had the opportunity to embrace diversity or eliminate it, we've chosen elimination. Not consciously, not maliciously, but consistently. We eliminated our biological cousins. We eliminated most of our linguistic diversity. We're in the process of eliminating our cultural diversity. And now we're working on eliminating our cognitive diversity, our ways of thinking, our approaches to understanding reality itself. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's what we do. It's what we've always done. And maybe it's what we'll keep doing until there's nothing left to eliminate, except ourselves. Think about it. Every major transition in human history has followed the same pattern. We encounter diversity. We compete with it. We absorb what's useful. We eliminate the rest. Hunter-gatherers became farmers. Farmers became industrialists. Now industrialists are becoming something else, something more connected, more standardized, more uniform. Each transition has made us more powerful, more numerous, more successful by conventional measures. But each transition has also made us less diverse, less flexible, less capable of surviving disruption. We've been trading resilience for efficiency so long that we've forgotten resilience was ever an option. And maybe that's just what intelligence does. Maybe consciousness, once it reaches a certain level of sophistication, naturally tends towards standardization. Maybe the ability to share information rapidly across large populations inevitably leads to cultural homogenization. Maybe the capacity for abstract thought necessarily results in everyone thinking in similar abstractions. If that's true, then what's happened to our cousins wasn't an accident or a tragedy. It was inevitable. The moment one branch of the human family developed the cognitive tools for rapid cultural transmission, for symbolic thought, for abstract reasoning, the fate of all the other branches was sealed. Not because we were better, but because we were more viral. Ideas, after all, behave like viruses. They spread, they mutate, they compete for mental resources. And just like biological viruses, the most successful ideas aren't necessarily the most beneficial to their hosts. They're just the most effective at replicating themselves. The idea that progress means standardization, that efficiency is more important than diversity, that newer is better than older. These aren't necessarily true ideas, but they're incredibly successful ideas. They spread rapidly, they're easy to remember, and they justify behaviors that help them spread even further. Maybe that's what consciousness really is. Not a tool for understanding reality, but a platform for viral ideas to compete and spread. And maybe the ideas that are best at spreading aren't the ones that help us survive long term, but the ones that help us eliminate alternatives in the short term. Consider how our most successful ideas work. The concept of progress tells us that whatever comes next must be better than what came before, so we don't need to preserve old ways of doing things. The ideal of efficiency tells us that standardized solutions are superior to diverse approaches, so we don't need to maintain alternatives. The belief in human exceptionalism tells us that we're fundamentally different from other species, so we don't need to learn from their evolutionary strategies. These ideas feel obviously true to most people in modern societies, but they're not universal human ideas. They're specific to our particular cultural moment, and they're incredibly recent in historical terms. Most human societies throughout history believed that older ways were better, that diversity was strength, that humans were part of nature rather than separate from it. But those alternative ideas lost the competition, not because they were wrong, but because they were less effective at motivating the behaviors that helped our particular branch of humanity spread across the planet and eliminate the alternatives. And now those viral ideas are doing to human diversity what we did to our cousins. They're spreading, they're standardizing, they're eliminating alternatives. Not through conscious choice, but through the same unconscious process that's been running for tens of thousands of years. The people abandoning their traditional languages aren't making a deliberate decision to reduce linguistic diversity. They're responding to economic pressures, social incentives, and practical necessities that make learning dominant languages more advantageous than preserving minority ones. The viral idea of economic efficiency is spreading through their decisions without them even realizing it. The communities giving up traditional ways of life aren't consciously choosing to eliminate cultural alternatives. They're adapting to technological changes, environmental pressures, and social transformations that make modern lifestyles more viable than traditional ones. The viral idea of progress is operating through their choices without requiring their explicit consent. So here we are at the end of a story that doesn't really have an ending. We are the only humans left, standing in the ruins of a diversity we barely remember losing. We carry fragments of our cousins in our DNA, echoes of vanished languages in our words, shadows of extinct ways of thinking in our dreams. But we are alone now in a way no species has ever been alone before. The extinction of our human cousins wasn't a single event, it was a process, one that we're still living through. Every time another indigenous language dies, every time another traditional way of life disappears into the noise of modernity, every time we choose efficiency over wisdom or progress over preservation, we become a little more alone. But maybe that's the most important thing to remember from all of this. We still have choices. The story of human extinction isn't finished being written. We can choose to preserve what remains of our diversity, to protect the alternatives we haven't yet eliminated, to remember that being the last human standing isn't a victory, it's a responsibility, because in the end, our extinct cousins left us more than just their DNA. They left us a warning, written in bones and silence. They showed us what happens when a species becomes too specialized, too dependent on specific conditions, too confident in its own permanence. The question now is whether we're humble enough to learn from their disappearance, or whether we'll join them in the fossil record, wondering too late what we could have done differently. We are the only humans left, but we don't have to stay alone. Remember that survival isn't guaranteed and neither is extinction. The choice for now is still ours.